tonight also is the Executive Director of ECEBC, and that's Emily Malechko. And Emily is going to be co-moderating this session, and we'll be taking some of the questions electronically. So we'll maybe hear from her a little bit later. And also you've heard Christine Butkus. Her voice has come through. Christine is working on the technology end as a moderator, and we appreciate that, Christine, because that is not my forte. So thank you for doing that. So a strong partnership is established between ECEBC and, get this acronym, CCCABC, which is the Coalition of Childcare Advocates of BC, and the Poverty Reduction Coalition of BC. And what we partnered in is the Week of Action for Childcare, which just began today, which is why we're having this webinar. And it takes place from March 1st to March 8th. And there's a variety of activities and events all the way through the week and around the province to ensure issues regarding childcare are front and center in people's minds. So our webinar tonight is called the 10-a-Day Childcare Plan as a Key to Reducing Poverty. We're very fortunate that our webinar is being supported by the United Way of the Lower Mainland. And with us tonight on this webinar, we have participants from all over the province, which is fabulous. I'll have to get a list later and see where everyone is calling in from. We have a great lineup of speakers for you tonight with a variety of topics, and I'm sure you're going to be very intrigued and engaged. So just a few housekeeping items before we begin our program. This program is being recorded and will be available at a later date to listen in and not be live, of course, so that's fortunate for those who can't make it tonight. And like Christine mentioned at the beginning, the participants, you're all being placed on mute by our moderator so that we can continue with and just hear our speakers, but you do have an opportunity to ask questions, and that will be handled by Emily and Christine. So in the upper right corner of your screen, you can see where you can ask questions of the panelists, and later on when we have our question and answer part of the program, your questions will be fed through to the people who are speaking tonight, and they will address the questions and respond. So I'm hoping that everyone's technology is working good for them and that they can hear and we're relaxed, and we'll get going. So tonight we have a great list of speakers. First of all, we have Sharon Gregson, a colleague and friend. And Sharon is spokesperson for the Coalition of Childcare Advocates of BC. And as a mother of 4 children, she's been advocating for high-quality, affordable, accessible childcare for a very long time, and we're very fortunate that she has done that. Welcome, Sharon. We also have Trish Garner with us. And in 2008, Trish co-founded the Poverty Olympics, a community festival that highlighted the disparity between public spending on the Olympics and people living in poverty, and many, many other things to do with poverty. She's the provincial organizer for the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. In her own words, Trish is a tea-swilling Brit with a passion for social justice. As a community organizer for the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition, a broad-based network of over 400 organizations throughout BC, she focuses on communications, outreach, and community engagement to raise awareness about the root causes of poverty and inequality and how we collectively can tackle them. She has a PhD in Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies from SFU and continues to work on LGBTQ issues. Trish lives with her partner and their 3 young children in East Vancouver. Welcome, Trish. And also joining us tonight is Viveca Ellis, and that's the Viveca we were referring to and hoping that we can get all the mics working for Viveca. And Viveca is joining us from the Single Mothers Alliance, and she's going to be sharing her own personal struggle dealing with childcare as it relates to tonight's topic. So welcome everybody from around the province, and welcome our guest panelists this evening. So we will start with Trish Garner, and Christine, I'm guessing that you're going to be turning over the mic to Trish. Thank you, Trish.
Great. Thanks, Charlene. So I am Trish Garner, the community organizer with the BC Poverty Reduction Coalition. Just as we bring the technology up, Apologies for my voice. I'm just getting over a bad cold bug. I guess this is one of the advantages of the webinar. I'm not going to pass any germs along your way. Great to be here with our childcare partners, and great to be talking to folks around the province. Thanks for the opportunity. Also want to thank our media sponsor, the Tyee, during this Poverty Free BC Action Week, of which this webinar is part of. So before I get into things, I would like to share a short story which describes our work and the importance of this kind of advocacy work. So in a small town, a group of fisherfolk gathered down at the river. Not long after they got there, a child came floating down the rapids calling for help. One of the group on the shore quickly dived in and pulled the child out. Minutes later, another child came, then another, and then many more children were coming down the river. Everyone was diving in and dragging children to the shore, then jumping back in to save as many as they could. In the midst of all this frenzy, one of the group was seen walking away. Her colleagues were irate. How could she leave when there were so many children to save? After long hours, to everyone's relief, the flow of children stopped and the group could finally catch their breath. At that moment, their colleague came back. They turned on her and angrily shouted, "How could you walk off when we needed everyone here to save the children?" She replied, "It occurred to me that someone ought to go upstream and find out why so many kids were falling into the river. What I found is that the old wooden bridge had several planks missing, and when some children tried to jump over the gap, they couldn't make it and fell through into the river. So I got someone to fix the bridge." So that's how we see our work at the Poverty Reduction Coalition, as fixing that bridge, as going upstream and working on that, and we see childcare as one of the key planks within that bridge. So I'm going to talk a bit today about what the river looks like in BC, what we're facing in terms of poverty, and then what that bridge looks like, what we can do to really tackle these issues. And we are a broad-based network of over 400 organizations around the province, including the Childcare Advocates of BC and the Early Childhood Educators of BC, and the United Way of Lower Mainland, and many more groups throughout the province. This is our human rights foundation to our work. It's very important to us to take this approach to poverty because it's a perspective that sees people in poverty as rights bearers, so treats them with dignity rather than as recipients of charity, in seeing them as pitiful or lacking or vulnerable. We see people in poverty as rights bearers, and we work with them as much as we can. This is just one of the most basic rights that we've signed on to for over 40 years now, and you can see inadequate food, clothing and housing, these basic needs that we're really not meeting in Canada or BC. And Viveca, hopefully, if we can get her online, will be speaking more about. Oh, hi Viveca, great. So later on, Viveca will chime in and tell us more about the human rights approach, in particular in relation to childcare. Okay, change the slide, please. So I'm going to go through 5 things everyone should know about poverty in BC. We've broken it down so that it's very easy to talk to other people about. Please click through again. So number 1, we are very generous. So BC is actually one of the most generous provinces in the country in terms of how much we give to charity. Our time, our energy, our clothes, our cans, all sorts. So I like to start here because it shows that number 1, we care about others, and number 2, we do want to take action, but go through to number 2, please. We have the second highest poverty rate in Canada, and we've had one of the highest or the highest for the last 15 years or so. So our charity, while it is amazing to have this community response, it's not enough to fill this huge gap, this huge social need that we have here in BC. So here you can see BC sitting at the second highest poverty rate, with about 600,000 British Columbians living in poverty. And we know that for children it's a higher rate. It's 1 in 5 kids living in poverty in BC, and even higher for those children in the 0 to 6 years old range. So very damaging there, because kids are growing during that period, and they're really not going to grow to their full potential if we are keeping them in poverty. Please click through again. We also have the biggest gap between rich and poor here in Canada. Click again, please. In terms of income, the top 20% of British Columbians earn about 10 times the poorest 20%. And I'm just going to show you the wealth here, because I think it's even more shocking. So the top 20% of British Columbians, the wealthiest, own 75% of the wealth. So that's all sorts of assets at the top there: houses, land, businesses, stocks and shares, yachts, you name it. And that translates into power over our politics and what policies get made, and power over our media as well, and what stories get told. So really damaging for us to see such concentration at the top. You'll notice that there's only 4 pieces of the pie there, because the poorest 20% have no wealth. They're in debt on average $9,000 to $10,000. So a real gap between rich and poor here in Canada. Can you click again, please? And here's just some of the implications. Wherever we are on that pie chart, our health is actually impacted by living in an unequal society. So number 3 here, most poor people are working. The 13% that are living in poverty, only about 4% are on welfare or disability rates. So it really is a low-wage story here in BC. We know for Metro Vancouver there's about 100,000 people making up the working poor. We don't have the particular statistics for the whole of BC, but we do know that BC is the worst province for working poverty. If you think about it, our minimum wage, which will go up, there was just a recent announcement, but right now it's $10.85 an hour, which is well below the poverty line. The living wage, which I know a lot of communities out there have calculated, is far higher than that. In Metro Vancouver, it's double that, so you can see why people are working 2 jobs or 3 to make ends meet. Please click through again. And this, courtesy of First Call, BC Child and Youth Advocacy Coalition, we can see what's happening in relation to income versus family costs. And you can see at the top there that childcare has increased by up to 35% over this year range. Rent up 26%, basic family costs up 18%, and income only up 10%. So you can really see why we're all feeling this affordability squeeze throughout the province. Next slide, please. And then, of course, people on welfare and disability benefits are working hard just to survive on these deeply inadequate rates that we have here in BC. So welfare, just basic welfare for a single employable person is $610 a month, which has been frozen for over a decade now, and we were disappointed not to see any raise in the recent budget announcements. You can imagine how hard it is to survive on that. There was an increase for disability rates both last year and this year, so it will go up by another $50 on top of the $983 I have there, but still far below the poverty line. And very hard to get on welfare. We've seen closures of welfare offices in the province and a move from in-person welfare cases to through the phones or online, which is hard for folks who don't have access or don't have the digital literacy. I usually show a video at this stage, and I think through webinar it doesn't really work, so I encourage people to go and check out some short videos we have both about accessing welfare, a personal story there, and working poverty, and you can find them at povertymythbusters.ca. Next slide, please. And just to give you a sense of how far below the poverty line someone on welfare is, I've just done up this little chart for you. So a single employable person, the welfare income is only about, just below 40% of the poverty line. So deeply, deeply in poverty there. And you can see for the other groups there's a range. Next slide, please. And number 4 is BC is the only province without a poverty reduction plan now. So everywhere else has developed or in the final stages of developing a poverty reduction plan of some sorts. And if you can just click through once, the successes should come up there. So we see here that Newfoundland and Labrador, which is a good example with us because they used to share the worst poverty rate, and a Conservative Premier, Danny Williams, just made this commitment and brought in a comprehensive plan, and they reduced poverty for those number of folks. And one of the best things they did actually was raise the welfare rate for single parents to the poverty line and reduced food insecurity by 50% for that group. And they did a number of other good measures. New Brunswick, you can see there, Quebec, a lot of people lifted out of poverty, and of course their best practice is their universal childcare program, which perhaps Sharon will talk about. So some really good comparisons across the country of things that we could definitely do here. Next slide, please. Again, thanks to First Call for this. This really shows the power of that government intervention, sorry. So we can see here that Quebec is actually the best in terms of how much redistribution they do through taxes and transfers, and are able to bring the child poverty rate down by a huge 46%. We're pretty far down the pack there, only bringing it down by 27%. So I think this really shows the power of government intervention. Next slide, please. And here's just one particular example that First Call are focusing on, and this is in the child benefits that different provinces provide. And you can see the stark difference between BC and the other provinces in terms of the amount and also the age range. So BC only gives it for the 0 to 6-year-old range, while everywhere else it goes up to 18 years because kids are kids until they're 18. And then in the benefit amounts, I mean, we're higher than some in terms of the yearly amount. Some of the provinces that have lower costs of living, but in terms of total lifetime investment, we're far, far below. And I mean, the comparison between the top and the bottom between us and Quebec is quite staggering. So that's really something to highlight there. Next slide, please. So number 5, we can afford this. This is an argument that often comes up from government or from business, and we actually have the research to show that poverty, keeping people in poverty currently costs $8 to $9 billion, and that's in healthcare costs, criminal justice costs when people are making difficult choices, and lost productivity when we're not actually giving people gainful employment. So $8 to $9 billion is what we're paying for right now. If we put a poverty reduction plan in place, it costs just half that at $3 to $4 billion. So it's an investment, a long-term investment, and we can actually save money in the long run. Next slide, please. And this is what a poverty reduction plan for BC could look like. This is the plan we're advocating for, and this is the plan that we have this amazing collection of 400 organizations behind, which is really an inspiring vision. So we include higher wages and welfare and disability benefits. So on the income side there, we need to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour and significantly increase welfare and disability. And then we need to reinvest in building housing. 10,000 social housing units is now would meet the need. We of course need to adopt the $10 a day childcare plan, and Sharon will talk more about that. A critical piece, we know that housing and childcare are the top costs facing families, and so those two pieces are critical. And then healthcare, dental, optical, we need to eliminate MS premiums completely, and great that the government is moving in that direction, and we've been advocating for that for a long time. Education, we need to fund adequately across the board, so K to 12, and also make university post-secondary education accessible. I actually went to university in England when tuition was free and you could get low-income grants, so it is possible, down to political will to make that accessible. And then the last pillar is just to recognize that there are some groups that face much higher rates of poverty, and that we need to do some targeted policies there to make sure no one's left behind. So it's indigenous peoples, refugees, immigrants, including particularly temporary foreign workers and farm workers, people with disabilities, single mothers. 1 in 2 single mothers face poverty, single senior women and transgender folks, and foster youth aging out of care. So there's lots we could do to make sure we're behind in this vision of a poverty-free BC. Next slide, please. So what you can do, moving on to how you can get involved and what kind of actions you can take. Next slide, please. Of course, we are in a critical time right now. We're in election season, so please join us in our election campaign called Make Poverty Public, and there's 2 streams to that. We're going to be telling stories of folks living in poverty to really represent and show the diversity of experiences out there, and that really it could be you, it could be me, it could be any one of us that hit a roadblock in life, so telling stories. And the other side of Make Poverty Public is that we want to use this opportunity again to highlight that this is a government responsibility, and just as we have public health care, we need public poverty reduction. So that's the argument that we'll be making through this campaign. Next slide, please. So we know from a poll done by one of our partners, the BC Federation of Labour, that 78% of British Columbians want a poverty reduction plan from the government, and quite a high number of BC Liberals as well within that, at 67%. So we just need to, at this stage, mobilize around that and inspire people and get people out to vote. So I'm going to go through some of the things that we're up to that you can get involved with. Next slide, please. So all candidates are listening right now, so a great time to make your voice heard. So I encourage you to get involved with all candidates meetings or host all candidates meetings, and we are putting together a support kit for that. And there'll be all candidates meetings with a bit of a twist. We're calling them Celebrations of Humanity, and they're actually focused on a model where most of the evening is spent hearing stories from folks in your communities living in poverty, and then the candidates have a very brief chance at the end of the evening to respond to what they've heard and to answer one simple question: will you commit to a poverty reduction plan with legislated targets and timelines? A yes or no answer. And this way it really focuses the meetings on the realities and the accountability from the candidates, not a laundry list of things that, that might or might not have an effect. You can call in to radio talk shows, write to newspapers. I don't know if Sharon will mention it, but they have a great letters to the editor tool on their website now. And of course, just talking with friends and family and work colleagues and getting the word out that poverty is an election issue and that we want better for BC. Next slide, please. So we are in the middle of our Poverty-Free Action Week, and as I said, the Childcare Day is today, and that's why we're here on this webinar. If you're in Metro Vancouver, please join us at the rally on Saturday, this Saturday, March 4th. Really important for everybody to be there. Bring your banners, bring your signs, bring your kids. It'll be fun. There'll be speakers, music, sign making. So it's at the library in Vancouver. And then there's a couple more days that you can join in as well. There's a film screening tomorrow for the Welfare Day, and a guacamole cooking for justice lesson on the Housing Day. So if you're local, you can join in on those. If you're not local, the health folks started a social media action which you can take part in. So we have some signs. You can go to this website, povertyfreebc.ca, and print out a sign which has a space and then reduces poverty, so you can fill in the space of what you think reduces poverty, and we have some examples there, and take a selfie and tag us on Twitter and Facebook, hashtag PovertyFreeBC. There's been a ton of photos coming in, so please send more. We'd love to see you from all around the province. Next slide, please. We'll also be hosting a speaker series. We usually do this, just click once more maybe. I think we're missing some pieces of that. There we go. We usually do this once a year. We're doing 3 in the lead up to the election. It's called Value BC, Equality, Justice and Prosperity for All. So each evening is focused on one of those values. We've already done equality, and we brought in David Morley from UNICEF Canada along, partnered him with Adrian Montani from First Call, and so they talked about equality for children, and so that is available. There's a webinar recording actually if you want to check that out. The next one coming up is on March 29th, Prosperity for All, with these wonderful leaders here. So Tamara Vrooman from Van City, Anita Huberman from Surrey Board of Trade, and Janet Austin from YWCA. So locally you can come out and join us, but provincially we'll be live streaming through Facebook, so you can join us there as well. It'll be the evening of March 29th. Next slide, please. We'll also be doing some Get Out the Vote work, and you can do this in your communities as well. We're partnering with Samara Canada and getting trained up on their Vote pop-up kits, and they will send these around the province and do training online, so you can do this too. We really feel like it's important to get the poor vote out. Traditionally, and actually as inequality increases, those at the bottom tend to feel more disenfranchised and don't vote. So it's really important that we get those folks out to vote. So that is the work that we'll be doing in the lead up to the election. We haven't done this kind of on the ground work before, but we're really excited to do it this time around. Next slide, please. And here's how you can connect with us. At our website, you can connect to our newsletter and stay up to date on all of these things that are happening, and then through Facebook and Twitter. And please email me with any questions. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was interesting to see as the plan rolled out. You showed us the context in Canada, and also showed us a path forward, and I love the celebrations of humanity that you were talking about and ways to hold candidates accountable for addressing poverty, and also to see just how deeply this is connected to the 10-a-day childcare plan as part of the poverty reduction plan. So thank you so very much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about that. I wanted to remind of our participants to just keep typing your questions in. They are going to our monitors. They're keeping them up on their screen as we go. So please continue to do that all the way along. Thank you again, Trish. So I'll introduce now Viveca Ellis. And Viveca is going to be sharing her personal story with us. And thank you, Viveca, and welcome.
Thank you very much for having me here this evening. Can everybody hear me all right at this point?
I think we're good. Yeah, I think everything's good.
Okay. Okay, excellent. So thank you. Yes, my name is Viveca Ellis, and I'm one of the co-founders of the Single Mothers Alliance. And the way I came into my own sort of, I call it passion work as an advocate, an anti-poverty and women's and children's rights advocate is really just all through my own personal story. So I'm happy to share it this evening, and then also talk a little bit about the organization that we have, and also my recent work with another group on the international human rights efforts. So when my son was 4 weeks old, I became a single mother, and as I'm sure very many on this webinar know, you know, the postpartum period is full of stress and very challenging, and for individuals who may have experienced some kind of trauma in their past, it can actually cause trauma. And in my case, that is what took place. I had to exit unsafe and insecure situation when my son was 4 weeks old very abruptly. So at that time, I did lose my home and my furniture and the security that I had. So basically, we know that when this happens to women, they usually end up in a shelter, or in my case, I had the shelter of my parents' home. But at that time, you know, when this kind of thing takes place, you're basically thrust into poverty. So I did have maternity leave for the initial year because I did have a salaried job prior to having my son. But that was still not much. And when that was over, I began my struggle with childcare. And I am somebody who, I'm a political person. I've always been political, but I was not aware prior to having a baby about just how dire the situation is for all people who try to access childcare. But what happened was I tried to grab a sort of random survival job, a sort of low-paying, precarious job that would allow me the flexibility that I needed at that time to take care of my baby and navigate the family law system. But unfortunately, you know, this grabbing of precarious part-time work is precisely what women do when we cannot access the child care that we need to actually secure sustainable employment. So what happened was I ended up hiring, I find a child care spot. I was desperate. I was making all of the calls. And I ended up hiring somebody, a Russian immigrant, we'll just call her Ilana, and she herself, she was a woman in poverty as well. She was struggling to get on her feet here in Canada, and for me, it really was a sort of last-ditch attempt to try to get out of the house and begin getting back on my feet. So she ended up charging about $11 an hour, and I was getting out of the house to make it $13 an hour. So I was taking home $2 an hour. It really was a complete mess. And I, you know, taking the eagle's eye perspective of the situation, an awareness in me began to grow of how lack of childcare really truly plunges women and children and also families into poverty, and really makes it hard for them to also climb out of it despite their best efforts. So looking at the three of us, myself struggling to get back to work, struggling to get on my feet, Ilana, who was also struggling to secure a legitimate and feasible income here in Canada, and yet there she was working precariously for very low wages, no benefits. I mean, this is not what we want for immigrant women in our country in British Columbia. So and then my son, who was in a unregulated childcare setting, and to be honest, you know, there were issues with how she managed behavior. She said she wanted to access more training and upgrade her credentials, which was necessary, but she couldn't access any resources to do that. So this really was the situation. Now at that time, for me to work that job full-time, which was just hovering at minimum wage, I would have still lived $8,000 below the poverty line. So we can see here that the child care crisis is really a women's poverty crisis, a workforce access and participation crisis for mothers, and truly child poverty, but it's also in combination with cost of housing. Because the difference in terms of what you still have to pay out your subsidy, because that difference for an infant is still $1,200 or $1,300 a month, if you are not in affordable housing, there's no way you can actually afford to work. So I really, because of a lack of affordable childcare and being in the vulnerable place that I was in, I got to the point where I had to turn to welfare. And that is not a place that any of us ever wants to find ourselves. Thank God it was there. How unfortunate that our rates are so abysmally low. So that was sort of the wall, that lack of childcare I felt backed me up against. And when I looked around, I realized I saw hundreds of other women in the same situation. And it dawned on me when I got a hold of a First Call Child Poverty Report card and read some other things that we had what seemed to me like a quiet women's poverty crisis in relation to lack of child care. So we know that of all children in poverty, even though about 18.5% of all children in BC are in single-parent families, we know that 49.4% of children in poverty are in single-mother-led families. So all of this fired me up, and I banded together with other women, and we founded the Single Mothers Alliance, which is a community-based organization, and we focus on women's and children's rights, anti-discrimination, and poverty. And so we spent a year talking to women in the Lower Mainland and around the province, because our organization is based on a particular community organizing model where all of the campaigns and everything that we do, we source from the grassroots membership. So we brought women together for a year, and we said, you know, what are the issues impacting your life? Now, we knew we were going to hear about childcare. We heard about lots of other very interesting things, 5 main issues. But of course, childcare was number one. And majority of the women in the Single Mothers Alliance are on welfare. And what they came out to share was very much similar to what I experienced. They do now wait out the early years on income assistance because they can't find spots. They have negative experiences, of course, when they turn to the precarious childcare in the basement suites in wherever, East Vancouver or whatever other town around BC, where there's simply another woman trying to make ends meet. They didn't feel comfortable with that situation. They didn't feel that woman had the resources she needed to do offer the quality care, despite their best efforts. So they came out and they in droves to talk to us about this. And because the CCABC and so many others have been working so hard on this issue for so many decades, the Single Mothers Alliance just endorses the 10-a-day plan. And if and when needed, we pipe up about it. But the other piece that is important from our perspective is working on multiple levels at once. So, you know, we have our community-based advocacy, civic, municipal, provincial, federal, and then our international obligations as a country and as a province. And the Single Mothers Alliance was invited to join the BC CDAW group, which is a coalition that I know the Coalition of Child Care Advocates has been in for a long time, working very hard with everybody there. And it's a diverse group that reports to the United Nations on CDAW, which is the Convention on the Rights of Women. And I think that it is extremely important when we're talking about childcare to remind the public and to talk to each other about setting the bar very high without any structure protecting myself and Alana and my very vulnerable infant son through all those years. I think there's a violation of right across the board. And when we look at the treaties that Canada has ratified, we've ratified 7, including the rights of the child and the one on women's rights. And when we position childcare as an economic right of women, and that children have a right to not be at risk in childcare settings, we need to remember that these are fundamental human rights, not just the issues of little advocacy fringe groups of angry women, like as we often get pigeonholed. And I think that when we remember and we strive to remember our elected officials and our current government, that Canada has been failing to live up to our international obligations, and in fact slid back, particularly under our previous Prime Minister. It's important work to accomplish. And at the CDAW review in October, when I was in Geneva, working on that, you know, we addressed poverty, we addressed childcare right up front, and it is contained in their concluding observations. They say here, the lack of affordable childcare facilities and the low use of parental leave of fathers is a #1 priority, should be a #1 priority for Canada, and that we need to create more opportunities for women to gain access to full-time employment, including by adopting a rights-based national childcare framework in order to provide sufficient and adequate childcare facilities, etc. So that was accomplished by CCABC and West Coast Leaf and others who are framing the right to childcare as a women's rights issue, and that's a very important perspective to take. So when I put all of this in perspective, and I think I'm a few years ahead now. My son is 7. He's quietly playing Lego behind me here. And when I talk to women in the Single Mothers Alliance who are in the throes of the early years, and when we see the extremely, really the devastating and quality child care on their lives and on the vulnerable infants, and we know that Canada lags far, far behind other developed nations in terms of our early years across the board. I think that we can't let our political powers that be off the hook, and I think that we need to amplify all of our voices and really speak up to truly protect British Columbians and in particular children. So that's all I have to say this evening. Thank you very much for allowing me here to share my story, and I just look forward to answering questions at the end.
Thank you very much. That was very compelling. I can't help think, as an early child educator, coincidentally, we opened up here in the Comox Valley a brand new infant toddler center just today. And I have to say, it was a huge struggle. However, my favorite part was being able to phone a family and tell them, we have a spot for your child. And some of the women broke down in tears because they were due to go back to work in weeks and had nothing. And so, you know, as an early child educator, just to see the impact that that one space has for a family, it was just incredible. I appreciate you sharing your personal story with us. And it is a personal story, but as you mentioned, unfortunately, it's not uncommon, and I appreciate that you shared from a rights perspective. But again, as an early child educator, I can't help think, you touched a bit about this, about how poverty affects the development of the child. So from a women's rights perspective, and you touched on the child's rights perspective, and I just think that that combination is very powerful, and we just can't let them off the hook. So thank you so very much for sharing your story with us.
Thank you very much.
So next in line, we have my friend and colleague, Sharon Gregson. The Early Child Educators of BC have been working in tandem with the Coalition of Child Care Advocates of BC, and that's what Sharon does. She's a spokesperson for the CCC-ABC, and I'm very thrilled to have her come and speak to us specifically about the plan, and it'll just wrap it all up and bring it all into context, everything we've heard from Trish and Viveca. So welcome, Sharon.
Thanks, Shar. And before I start, I have to say huge congratulations for opening up a badly needed childcare program in your community. So I've been watching the pictures on Facebook, and it looks so exciting. So congrats.
It very much is. Thank you.
So this is kind of new to me because I don't have a clicker to move this on. So Christine, it's very nice of you to do that. So I'm going to walk through a presentation of the plan and touch on some of the implementation questions that people often ask as we get towards the end. So many of you will know that the real name of the plan is a community plan for a public system of integrated early care and learning. So that's not a name that anybody besides a couple of us ever remember. And so very quickly when we launched the plan in 2011 between ECEBC and the coalition, the branding rose to the surface of 10 a day. And so that's now how it's known around the province and in fact across the country. And I just saw an article in the Vancouver Sun today that says that there's overwhelming support from the public for the 10 a day plan now. So it's very exciting news in the Vancouver Sun. So I encourage you to read that in the paper tomorrow. So I'll click on to the next slide, please. So often when media does interviews with us, we describe for them the child care crisis. And those of you who are either parents or caregivers or even grandparents will know what this looks like at a personal level. So we have now getting close to 600,000 children in this province between 0 to 12, and Stats Canada says that those numbers are going to go up over the coming years. Of those children, 363,000 have got mothers that are in the paid workforce. So the majority of children have got mothers who are working, and yet we've only, there you see, we've only got just over 100,000 regulated childcare spaces. So we've got a whole lot of children we know that are in the unregulated sector, meaning that there's nobody monitoring health and safety standards, and potentially some of those children are in illegal settings. And so this is a huge worry, particularly for infant toddlers, when children can't go home at the end of the day and describe the kind of care that they received. So next slide, please. So that's the space crunch, but we've also got the unaffordability issue. So the last slide had me with my chart. Christine, if you go back one slide. So this is me when I first started doing childcare advocacy, and I was pretty chubby, and I just had a baby, and those were my darling 2 boys and 2 girls. And now, if you click to the next slide, this is pretty much what they look like now. So this is how long that some of us have been fighting for this issue, and I'm sure some of you on the phone have been, on the webinar, have been fighting for just as long. And so we've seen the unaffordability of childcare get worse year after year after year. And Trish mentioned some of the, over the last few years, how the cost of childcare has escalated so much. So the numbers in white that you see are provincial averages. The numbers in green are the Vancouver numbers. So unaffordable for most families. In fact, we know that so many families don't even bother to put themselves on waiting lists because even if they did get a space, they couldn't afford it. And I always tell politicians that the only reason there are any empty spaces in licensed childcare settings is because there's nobody in the community who can afford the space, not because nobody needs it. So you'll see there also that in Vancouver we've got one childcare provider with fees that are now over $2,100 a month per child. So unaffordable for all but pretty comfortably wealthy families. And yet high fees don't mean high wages for the educators working in those programs. And even those families who qualify for the low-income subsidy, if you're poor enough to qualify for the subsidy, you're too poor to actually have the hundreds of dollars that you need to do the top-up to pay the actual fee. So those of us who provide childcare, over the years, we have seen fewer and fewer subsidized families in our programs, particularly in infant toddler, where the gap between the subsidy and the actual fee is the greatest. So next slide, please. So, given the crisis, it's why we've got a plan to win, and that plan is the $10 a day plan. And this is a picture that Natalie sent, and I love to show this because it's, oh, whoa, you jumped ahead. This slide shows that the $10 a day plan is not just a plan for Metro Vancouver. This is a plan for the entire province. It resonates just as much on Vancouver Island as it does in Prince George, as it does in Kootenays, as it does in the Okanagan. This plan resonates in all communities because basically we're talking about three simple things. We're talking about having quality spaces for children, whether that's in a center or in licensed family care. We're talking about affordability for parents, and we're talking about decent wages and working conditions for early childhood educators with the pay that goes along with that. So those are three simple things, and it's just as relevant in any community across the province as any other. So it's been 100 years since some women, not all women, some white women first got to vote in British Columbia. So here we are 100 years later, and we darn well need quality, affordable childcare to actually achieve women's equality. So next slide, please. So we have some new allies that we perhaps didn't have a decade or so ago. The man with the round glasses, top left, is that is Heckman. That's James Heckman, the Nobel Peace Prize winner in the States, who talks about the value of investment in the early years and how that has benefits throughout the whole life course of an individual. The bottom guy with glasses is Craig Alexander. He was the chief economist for the TD Bank of Canada. And I've actually seen him do presentations at childcare conferences because he talks about the value to the economy of investing in the early years. And that's Christine Lagarde from the International Monetary Fund, and Barack Obama, of course. They all talk about the value for governments investing in the early years and the benefits to the economy and to families. So next slide. So quickly, I'm going to run through this because I know we want to leave time for some questions. So the highlights of the plan. So a new piece of legislation in Victoria that calls for the legislation of rights for First Nations to design, deliver, and govern their own services. And we're very humbled and very appreciative that the Union of BC Indian Chiefs just gave us support for the $10 a day plan, which is very meaningful. The new piece of legislation would speak to the rights of young children to access quality services and the rights of families to access quality, affordable care on a voluntary basis. And that lovely woman with the 2 children is the president-elect of ECBC, Sharon, who's on the phone with us. The next slide. So second highlight is a new home for childcare coming out of the Ministry for Children and Family Development, which is a child protection-focused ministry, as it should be, and moving childcare into the Ministry of Education. And that would be for programs that are in the community as well as programs that are school-based. Schools still starting at age 5, and welcoming in all existing childcare providers on an equal playing field. So whether it's for-profit or not-for-profit, center-based or family-based, all being welcomed into the new system. So next slide, please. So that means then a new role for boards of education. So elected boards would be mandated and funded, funding is of course the key, to plan in their communities to develop and govern the delivery of early care and learning, so childcare in their districts. And we know that school districts already do that kind of planning, and that kind of planning doesn't happen now for childcare. So that's a very important function when you start to build a system. Next slide, please, Christine. So the fourth highlight is really important, and often this is what rises to the surface when media is doing interviews. What does the $10 a day plan mean for families? So when a child care operator receives new public funding, perhaps through the delivery model of CCOF, the Child Care Operating Fund, they would be accountable to do these things: to lower parent fees to a maximum of $10 a day for full day care, $7 a day for part-time care, and to eliminate fees for families who earn under $40,000 a year. And there's been some very good conversation that's come out of some Facebook discussion on making sure that we are going to meet the needs of vulnerable families. So the second accountability measure then would be to make sure that we're improving the wages of early childhood educators and caregivers to an average of $25 an hour as a starting place across the province, and clearly as time goes by we'll need to readdress those averages. And that would also have a benefit package that often child care providers don't have now. Third highlight and accountability measures to include all children, including those with special and unique needs, and to be part of that community planning I talked about that school districts can do, to look at where we need more infant toddler care, where we need more school age care, to be part of community planning. And lastly, to have a program that's consistent with one of the early learning frameworks, so to have a play-based pedagogy. And that could be one of the Aboriginal frameworks, or what's sometimes known in BC as the ELF, through the Ministry of Education. So that's a bit of a snapshot. So the fifth highlight is to enhance kindergarten and grade 1, not on the model that they've built in Ontario, but learning from what they've done in Ontario. We would have early childhood educators working alongside teachers as professional colleagues to strengthen relationships in the classroom, to be able to cover the full working day and full working year, and frankly to enhance ECE practice in schools. So to have early childhood educators actually in those classrooms alongside teachers. And next slide, please. Sixth highlight. So then a real strong support for the middle years. We know that there's increasing attention to the importance of the middle years from UBC, and they've always had the EDI, and now they have the MDI that really tracks vulnerability in those crucial middle years. So having more provision for school age care, which would be grade 2 and up, through boards of education, and again welcoming in existing school age providers into the new system and expanding where there's a need across the province. And often people talk to me about those are the two big areas in their communities where there's a gap in childcare, is infant toddler for sure, but also in school age care. So this would address that by expanding spaces. Next slide, please. So the seventh and important highlight is investing in the workforce. And everywhere I go, and I'm sure there's nodding heads at the other end of the computer screens, is that we recognize that we'll never have the high quality childcare system that our province needs if we don't invest in the people delivering the service, because when you're talking about care and education, that comes from the people who are providing the service. So we need to make sure that we are investing in well-respected, well-educated, and well-compensated people. So that's where we start with the average of $25 an hour plus benefits, focusing on enhancing quality through people, respecting the expertise of early childhood educators, and being very focused on moving towards parity with teachers. So that would introduce more of the concept of the Bachelor of Early Childhood Education. Right now it's only Capilano University that offers that credential, so that would need to expand across the province and take into account things like distance ed and making sure that's available. And then moving towards the diploma as being the new minimum in group care, family care, and school-age care. And the plan is costed to include financial support for educators to upgrade their qualifications if that's their choice, and that's $1,250 a year for full-time educators. That's going to, really put a focus on people who want to make that change. The plan is very clear that mature providers who are comfortable where they are would be grandparented and not required to go back to school. And we've been asked recently, how do you define mature? And the way I'm defining it is I think people define that for themselves. They know if they fall into that category. Next slide, please. So where else has made this kind of shift of moving childcare out of a child protection ministry and into a ministry of education? Well, you can see there the peer nations around the world, other countries that have made that change. And in fact, if you look at the list there of provinces and territories, you can see that the majority now of other jurisdictions in Canada have already made that move. And there are First Nations in British Columbia who already have put childcare, the early years, into their Department of Education. So BC is actually one of the minority in Canada that hasn't yet made that move. And that picture is the old Mayor of Vernon, who invited children to support childcare into council chambers a couple of years ago, with Lynn reside there. So I appreciated being there that day. Next slide. So where to start? And this is the advice that we've been very public about. And if you've got a copy of the $10 a day booklet, you'll see that it's right up front. We suggest that governments immediately reduce fees in all infant-toddler spaces across the province, both in family and group care, that they eliminate fees for families who earn less than $40,000 a year, and start to work with school districts and municipal governments, regional governments, and the child care community to develop and implement early care and learning plans, so that we actually can start to build out the number of spaces we need and ramp up the system. Next slide. So implementation issues, and Emily Mleczko from ECEBC and I have had a number of discussions both online on Facebook with people and people we've met that have really started to bubble up some of the implementation issues that need further discussion. So we've had a suggestion that there could be multi-age expansion, thinking that that would be a good way to be able to meet the needs of more families and bring in more early childhood educators into the system. Being asked about talking about group health and welfare benefits for family child care providers. That suggestion came out of Kelowna. It's been suggested that we need to make sure that as new spaces are built and come online, that we have to ensure that vulnerable families have at least equitable and perhaps preferential access to those new spaces, and that we don't have some of what happened, perhaps has been the criticism in Quebec, that wealthier families had better access to new spaces. So we have to make sure that doesn't happen in British Columbia. We have to address the fact that people who work in family childcare don't work a traditional 9 to 5 shift, that they start early and they end late and have to get adequate compensation for that longer day. We have to, as I said, have a plan with post-secondary institutions around the province to expand those opportunities. We have to deal with private operator issues. So it was pointed out to me that private operators might have a bank loan that they took out to expand or to build a program, and so if they want to participate in the new system, how would that be dealt with? So I'm giving you a snapshot of some of the issues that have bubbled to the surface so that you know we're aware of them. We don't have quick and easy answers to all these things, but they're up for discussion, and we're certainly wanting to work through them and talk with people about some suggestions on how these issues can be dealt with. So next slide. So people ask all the time, well, doesn't Quebec already do this, and how does it work in Quebec, and does it pay for itself there? Well, the economists, particularly Dr. Pierre Fortin, looked at the Quebec childcare system, and you'll know that they started in 1997 with a $5 a day childcare plan, and it's a little bit more expensive than that now. And Pierre Fortin was able to demonstrate that after 12 years, the Quebec system was actually paying for itself because more mothers were able to move off welfare, as Viveca explained, and more were able to work. And when you're working, you're paying income taxes, and that creates revenue for government. So Robert Fairholm, another economist, has actually pointed out that investing in childcare has a bigger job multiplier effect for the economy than any other sector. And so there's lots of evidence of why this is a good investment, and it certainly made a difference in Quebec. Next slide. So we've done polling, and I mentioned the Vancouver Sun's just today releasing more polling, but it shows that there is huge support for the $10 a day childcare plan, and that people say they would vote for a political party who agreed to implement the plan, and they believe it's realistic. And more information about the poll that we did is on the website, tenaday.ca, if you want to go and have a look. The next slide. So people sometimes say, well, this seems like such a no-brainer. Why isn't government doing something about it? Well, interestingly enough, government's own finance committee that it puts together every year, that tours around the province asking British Columbians for their input, has recommended to its own caucus for the last 4 years, so this is the provincial government's finance committee, recommending to itself that it provide funding and support for the development and implementation of a child care plan. So clearly this is even on the radar of the provincial government. Next slide. So we've got 3 studies I'm going to quickly highlight that have talked about the economic benefits. So initially there was work done by Dr. Paul Kershaw and Linnell Anderson that talked about, and I won't read all the numbers there, you can see them, how many more women would be working with a quality affordable child care plan, how much more money government would collect in taxes, there'd be more ECEs and they'd be better paid. Business would save money because women could actually go back to work after they had a baby, and families would be saving money too that they could then spend in their local economy. Next slide. So another study was done in 2015 by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, an economist named Iglika Ivanova, and she looked at a 10-year implementation schedule for the plan and found that it's completely affordable, particularly now that we've got the federal government coming to the table with new child care funds. And all this work is on the website, so you can download it and find out more. The third economic analysis was just released in January, and this was very, very, very in-depth. It's a 50-page report by an economist that's worked for the federal government. He's got nothing to do with BC childcare, completely neutral. And he looked at the 7 to 10-year implementation and discovered that there would be an increase to our economy of 2% in British Columbia, or nearly $6 billion. And that when it's fully implemented, the plan would create over 69,000 new jobs, FTE jobs. So a huge positive impact on our economy and makes the plan pay for itself. Next slide. So with all that information, we're big on social media talking about the benefits of the plan, and you can see this kind of cute slide that we put out on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Just really trying to hit home that there are economic benefits and this plan needs to be implemented. Next slide. I hope you're all laughing at that slide, by the way. So we've got Justin Trudeau, our Prime Minister, and he has said that, which is a big reversal after 10 years of Stephen Harper, he has said that for Canadian families, high-quality, affordable childcare is more than a convenience, it's a necessity. So that was a breath of fresh air, and he's committed $500 million starting to flow for childcare starting in April. Next slide. So childcare is very, very, very much a political issue because it's gotten to such a crisis that it's just on everybody's radar. Even Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton had to have childcare in their platforms. And John Horgan from the NDP has said that if he's elected, he'll implement the $10 a day plan. And we're constantly pointing out to media that it actually isn't the NDP's plan, this is the community plan, and that he's agreed just to implement it. Next slide. So the Greater Vancouver Board of Trade has even said, leading up to the election, that they are encouraging the provincial government to work with the federal government and find ways to increase the supply and access to affordable childcare. So you know you've hit the big time when the Vancouver Board of Trade also thinks it's a good idea. Next slide. And so 2 million supporters and growing. So 46 local governments said that they support the plan. And I was just presenting on Monday night in Qualicum, so I'm hoping that they'll be adding their name too. We've got 30 school districts around the province, credit unions like Van City, the United Way of the Lower Mainland is a big supporter, Surrey Board of Trade, lots of academics, literally hundreds now of community and women's organizations, all our labor partners. In fact, today our latest labor partner is the BC Regional Council of Carpenters. We're glad to have them sign on. Lots of ECD experts across the country are endorsing us, and we're now over 13,000 individuals signing the petition. So those of you who haven't done it already, I hope you'll go to 10aday.ca and sign on. Next slide, please. So sometimes people say things can never change. Childcare has been like this forever and it's never going to change. So I have 3 quick slides to show you to reinforce that actually things do change. So this is the first one, and this is from a magazine. It looks like it's portraying domestic violence, but it was actually an advertisement for coffee. So, you know, we would never tolerate that kind of advertising today, so that's one thing that's changed. Next slide. How we think about children has changed. Here's an infant who's being given 7-Up out of a glass bottle, and the tagline is that 7-Up has the youngest customers in the business. So how we think about children and certainly about nutrition has changed. Next slide. And how we think about women's work has changed. So this is not a very old commercial. You can tell by the woman's haircut. But you know, this man is proudly saying that his food process does everything but cook because that's what his wife is for. Not something that many of us would think was very funny actually today. Next slide. So almost wrapping up here. So what's new? We've got a re-engaged federal government. We've got a lot more media attention. The Globe and Mail last Saturday, the Vancouver Sun tomorrow. I just saw the ad from the Comox Valley with a big full page about the $10 a day plan. We're all over the province. Our campaign is ramped up. We're doing much more online. New political support is raising the discussion from all political parties. The new socioeconomic analysis that was released in January, the provincial election, put it on your calendars, May 9th, and vote childcare. We're using social media to make sure people do vote childcare. And here we are starting our Childcare Week of Action, which is piggybacking on the Poverty Reduction Week of Action. Next slide, please. So, for those of you who have got your smartphones handy, or if you're with friends or neighbors, you can whip out your smartphone and you can use your text function and text the word sign to this number, and you'll automatically be signing the petition. So I'd love you to do that when you've got a minute. And that's it for my presentation.
Well, Sharon and I have done this presentation together, and I've also done it on my own, and that's it in a nutshell, Sharon. But wow, that was pretty condensed because it's so in-depth, but you really did manage to capture the important pieces that we want to share tonight. One of the interesting things that connects all the pieces from Trish and from Viveca and Sharon is the Money in Your Pocket campaign that was part of rolling out information and education about the 10-a-day plan, where we actually printed pretend money that looked very real, but it was pretend money. And I'd invite someone from the audience to come up who was paying for childcare, and I would give them back in pretend money the money that they would save every month if childcare were only $10 a day. And for them to have that in their hand and know what a difference that could make for their family in terms of poverty, in terms of health, in terms of spending in their community, and it's very impactful. So thank you so much, Sharon, for tying this all together for us. We're going to open up for questions, and my understanding is Emily Malechko, who with Christine has been behind the scenes, is going to be asking some questions that have been sent in to our panelists, and we'll see how that works for us. Emily?
Hi, everyone. So Sharon and I are going to be on the speakerphone, so I hope we can hear us okay. There are a number of questions that have come forward, so I'll try to pull them together. I'm mindful of the time because we have about 12, 13 minutes left that we promised that we'd have people off the phone by 8. But if we don't get through all of the questions, I'll ask the panelists to have a look at them and then answer them, and then we can post them on our website, because I think there's some really good ones here to be answered. So the first question I'm going to bring up, it's come up a couple of times. One person has said, we're excited to know that in Nelson there's a group of 17 people that are around in a coffee shop listening to the webinar and asking quite a few questions. So thank you for being here. So around the Child Care Resource and Referral Program. So somebody's asking, I'm a parent that uses my local Child Care Resource and Referral Program. How are they included in part of the plan? Sharon, do you want to?
Sure. So absolutely, parents are still going to need to have resource and referral access, and so we see that as continuing and being an integral part across the province of how parents would know where spaces are, and really needing to be better connected between CCR&Rs and the education system, so that that becomes more seamless for families. But definitely still seeing that link. And you know, Emily's here too, so I think, you know, if Emily can add stuff, I think that would be really helpful too.
Okay. I think this is a good question for you, Trish. Is there a consideration to have guaranteed income instead of welfare, et cetera?
Yeah, that is a question that's come up at the coalition. I mean, we're seeing it a lot more in the public. We're seeing it a lot more in the political sphere being taken up internationally, and some pilot projects in Ontario. So we're having that discussion right now. I'm not sure where we'll land at the coalition. We have some supporters who say that this would be great. This would actually value work that is not valued in our current capitalist economy, like caregiving, for instance, by providing a basic income. It would be good if, you know, you need to leave a bad workplace situation. You've got this basic income to support that. In terms of, you know, increasing automation of jobs, a basic income is good for that. But there are folks who have concerns, you know, what would be the level? Would that be adequate? We don't have an adequate welfare level, so what's to say that our basic income level would be adequate? And also there are definitely fears that politicians might bring in and mantle other social programs like housing, like childcare, if we had a universal childcare system, education, healthcare. You know, politicians could say, well, we're giving you the money, go out in the market and buy those things. So there are definitely pros and cons.
Thanks, Trish. So another question has come to us. It's, is the 10-a-day childcare intended to cover the total cost of the daycare, or will additional funding be needed? And if so, where would that additional funding come from?
Right, so it's Sharon here. So yeah, the $10 a day is just the parent portion. And so, of course, an operator, whether you're a family childcare provider or a group provider, you need additional income. And right now, there's something called CCOF, which is the Child Care Operating Fund. And it gives providers a small amount of money on a daily basis based on the age of the child and enrollment for the month. And so if we think about switching it around so that instead of the parents paying the bulk of their fees, that actually the bulk comes through that operating grant and the parents just contribute a small amount. So the operating grant, instead of being the tiny little piece of the budget that it is now, we would have enough in that grant to be able to cover the wages of the early childhood educators and run a quality program.
Thanks, Sharon. Another question comes to us: how can the plan be improved upon, and are there still areas that need to be expanded? How do you respond to EC practitioners who did not support the plan?
Well, I think maybe Emily and I can both answer that. There's definitely areas that we can expand on, and I think some of the recent discussions we've had on social media have made it clear that people are looking for detail, and some of that detail we just simply don't have because it's going to take some negotiation and with politicians and whoever agrees to implement it. We put the plan forward as the goal, and we've got some pieces that are benchmarks along the way to get there. But some of the intricacies of it absolutely still need to be worked out, and they need to be worked out with input from the childcare sector on a broader scale. And so we're identifying those issues. We're not afraid to identify what those aspects are that need further work. But we simply don't have the answer to every single question. Emily, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, and I think for us going out into the public, and particularly with social media, really picking up that there is a lot of misinformation out there, so that gives us an opportunity to go back out into community, use our own social media to get the real information out, and then hopefully that spreads outwards from that. So that has become really evident and important piece of the work that we need to do.
Yeah, I think that when people get worried about the $10 a day plan, if they don't understand it, it's sort of easy to say, well, why don't we just increase subsidy and that'll fix it. But actually, if we look to the past, we know that if you increase subsidy, fees just go up, and that makes it harder for families who don't have subsidy to afford the fee. And in fact, subsidized families are no further ahead. Increasing subsidy doesn't build a quality system. It doesn't pay educators what they're really worth. So subsidy alone is not the answer. So there's a lot of work for us to do still. We recognize that, to talk about the plan and try and be around the province and talk to as many people as possible about what it really means.
This is Charlene, and I'm an early child educator that works on the floor with children and have for almost 26 years, 27 years. And the one thing, and I've been involved in this from the very beginning in 2010, but one thing that strikes me is it's going to require change from all of us. And I think for me, rather than having things happen to us, for us to be involved and for us to be the change and to inform the change. And it will require change, and things aren't maybe not going to look the same as they were before, but what it is now is just isn't working. I see it for families. I see it for early child educators. So as Sharon and Emily have said, it is a little frustrating when we don't have those particular details. This is a giant step forward. We're in the middle of the room and we're screaming, we're not going away. Patience, willingness to be open and learn and ask great questions. There's been some great questions. I think that's going to get us a long way.
I think just to add on what Sharon was saying about the childcare subsidy, that's been the response from the provincial government across the board on these issues. So whether it's the childcare subsidy or the rental assistance program, and we know there are just so many problems with that kind of approach because they don't invest in a public service. The rental assistance program is not doing anything to build affordable housing. And the childcare subsidy is not doing anything to provide affordable childcare spaces. The thresholds are so low, the bureaucracy, the paperwork to apply, low-income folks can't pay up front. The thresholds have been frozen and the subsidies have been frozen for so many years. So we just know that those programs don't work.
And Trish and everybody, if I may just add, I think too, when we talk about the subsidies and people talk about just increasing the subsidy amount, the most important thing, and I know it's already been mentioned, but just to reiterate, is talking also about quality. We don't want to sort of overemphasize affordability and not forget about quality, because that surrounds me now in the Single Mothers Alliance, and the majority of their children are in very, very low quality care environments. And we did just have a child, now I don't know the details, but a child did pass away in East Vancouver. That could be any one of the women that I work with. So I think, you know, as the solution, it does absolutely nothing for really putting that quality in place that the $10 a day plan would take care of.
Yeah, thanks, Viveca.
I think we'll end with one more question. There's a number more, so like I promised, we'll get these back to the guest speakers and we can have the opportunity to answer them and then post them on our website. But the last one we'll ask is, how will the Board of Education govern this? With ever-changing funding in education, how will this funding remain stable? Education funding is seeing many cutbacks, and who would manage the licensing of centers?
So I'll answer very quickly. You're right, education is not perfect either, the education sector, the K-12, but quite honestly, it's light years ahead of where we are in childcare. So the per spending dollar amount on a K-12 student is over $8,000 a year by the provincial government. It's only a couple of $100s a year for a child in the childcare system. So as imperfect as it is, it's a better home than where we are now, and it really just means that we have to be strong advocates. And just because we elect a government that says that they'll implement the plan doesn't mean that we would take our foot off the gas in advocating for quality and advocating for stability and expansion and all the things that we know will need to be part of the plan.
Thanks, Sharon.
Thank you, Sharon. I think just in order to get us off by 8 o'clock, I think we'll draw it to a close. I think the dialogue could go on for a very long time, and I hope that it will in your individual communities or at your workplace. And certainly, as Emily mentioned, being able to have these questions addressed by our panelists, and you'll be able to go onto the website and have a look at those. You can also contact, there's been a lot of contact information given out tonight. I really urge you to get as many facts as you can, ask questions, become involved in a way that you're comfortable. I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists, Trish and Viveca and Sharon, for taking the time to talk with us tonight, and for Christine Butkus and Emily Malechko, who have been moderating and writing down all the questions and making sure that we don't miss something. And also to you to participate, thank you very much. I know you all work busy days, and we're very happy that you're interested in this topic, and I hope that we've painted a picture that creates some understanding for you and maybe shows how you can move poverty reduction and the $10 a day plan forward in your communities and be part of the Week of Action. Thank you all so very, very much, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.